This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 266. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Before we get started, your usual Clara article plug, Alan, is troubleshooting ZFS, common issues and how to fix them.
Yeah, so to try to help people as they come into some of the most common issues, we have a post here that walks through what to do when you get a checksum error. And when a disk fails, how do you replace it properly? And how do you deal with the fault management tools in ZFS and blink the right LED so that you can swap the right disk in the chassis? What do you do if you have to restore a snapshot, but to recover an accidentally deleted or overwritten file? And how do you change the encryption key of one specific data set without messing up the others? And how do you deal with the errors you might get if you're trying to do ZFS replication with encryption and you mess it up a little bit? Or what if you've changed the encryption keys on a bunch of different data sets and you want to set them all back to the same key? How do you do that? And it walks you through all those things.
Right. So what you did was put all of the common issues that people would have in one article, so it'd be nicely SEO'd. Got you?
Yep.
Well, link in the show notes as usual. Nvidia and Intel to co-develop multiple generations of chips as part of a $5 billion deal. Things keep looking up for Intel, when it comes to investment.
I think that's kind of like saying things are looking up for that zebra when one hyena after another shows up to take a bite, but sure.
This is somewhat unexpected, though.
It's very unexpected. I'm still kind of struggling to understand how the whole thing is supposed to work just physically, because Intel has very famously not been able to manage its foundries enough to keep up the competition for quite a long time now, and that has not shown any signs of changing. So I'm not sure what you get when the foremost GPU company in the world says it's going to start embedding its products into Intel's processors when its products require a more advanced foundry than anything Intel has to offer.
Well, it suggests to me that Intel will have to start using TSMC, essentially.
Well, I don't think that's the point because, like, NVIDIA's, I'm guessing, buying all the capacity from TSMC they can get. And so they're hoping to diversify their source. I don't know if that means getting the parts that don't need to be from the more advanced process done by Intel to free up TSMC capacity or what, but it'll be interesting to see.
This is also interesting because in an environment where tariff wars are getting thrown around a lot from a lot of different directions, and a lot of them center on, semiconductor-related technologies, this is really going to make it harder for a particular administration to throw around the kind of tariffs that it likes to threaten. Because in order for this NVIDIA and Intel cooperation to really take off and have these two Go Team USA, American companies dominating the market in a way that one would assume the American administration would like, you can't tariff the crap out of TSMC and make that work. This is yet another instance of like isolationism just doesn't work anymore. Like, we are an interdependent world, and there's no one country that can go it alone.
Well, shall I put my cynical hat on?
When do you take it off?
Well, indeed. In this particular case, it seems to me that NVIDIA is cozying up to the American administration with this.
Well, trying not to get blocked from selling to China seems to be the cynical version of it.
Well, yeah. It's all geopolitics, essentially. I mean, you're talking about tariff wars, Jim. Have we not seen exception after exception to said tariffs? If people kiss the ring, let's not beat around the bush here.
We certainly have, but that doesn't stop the very popular, very widely amplified rhetoric of, let's just stop it all at the border. What will they do without our technology? And even 20 years ago, the answer to that really was, well, if you do that, they just develop their own technology and become less dependent and become less valuable trading partners for us. And none of this isolationist stuff ever works in the long run. It just doesn't.
Bring it back to the more technical part. It's also going to be interesting to see what this does to Intel's graphics stuff. Like, I know they've had very many false starts and aren't really necessarily getting very far with making GPUs. But they did recently actually launch their line of server GPUs that can do virtual desktop. So they basically have a way to have one GPU in your machine that can do SRIOV to show up as multiple separate cards that you can PCI pass through with Proxmox or whatever into separate VMs, so that each VM actually has a real GPU to accelerate graphics, so that when you're doing like remote desktop and hosting hundreds of Windows machines or whatever, you can do that. Nvidia has had that for a while, but they charge an extra big license fee for each VM for that. Whereas Intel has a card you can buy and run like 16 or more GPUs in VMs without an extra license. You just buy the card and you can do it. And that is starting to become a real breakthrough, to have that option, to have VDI at scale with just buying this Intel GPU. And does this mean Intel's going to get completely out of the GPU game now?
Borrowing Joseph's cynical hat, I might point out that the ability to do GPU pass-through to multiple VMs under KVM for NVIDIA cards has been around for quite a few years now. It's just never worked reliably. And
they charge a license for it.
Yeah, exactly. Because you just drew a big fat red underline on the reason why NVIDIA doesn't really want it to work right, because, you know, that's part of the value add, charge extra money for it thing.
It sounds like Intel are not going to stop doing their integrated graphics, but their dedicated graphics cards, which, like you said, have been a bit of a non-starter.
Well, because they keep canceling them just before launch every time and so on. They're really, like, part of Intel's problem for quite a while now has been they start something and then cancel it. They just had so many changes of leadership and so on that they've not consistently had a vision of what they were trying to do. They were just trying everything and never actually finishing anything.
Intel is the new Google. Pass it on.
Yeah.
But on the consumer side, we might see something like the SoCs that you get in the Steam Deck and ROG Allies and other handheld gaming devices with Intel and Nvidia. But instead of it being discrete graphics, it'll be one SoC that'll be more efficient, in theory.
Yeah, except for I think most of what this is going to be about is those Qualcomm ARM Windows laptops that we were talking about a while back. The first ones that had that recall or whatever it was, where they have, you know, the TPU built into the CPU. It's going to be, here's an Intel GPU with AI built in, not with an NVIDIA GPU built in.
Well, why not both?
Maybe both.
Also, Joe, when you're talking about, you know, a system on a chip, the graphics in that is integrated graphics by definition, because it's a system on a chip.
Well, yeah, but integrated NVIDIA rather than integrated Intel.
Sure. Or one might point out, instead of integrated Radeon.
Well, yeah, that's the point as a competitor to AMD.
It's got to be kind of strange looking at this from anywhere near the helm of Intel right now, because on the one hand, AMD is such a laughable lack of competition, but that's only because Intel's had its foot on AMD's neck for so freaking long. It's, you know, it's the effect of generations of depressed market share. In technical terms, AMD is something beyond a competitor for Intel in terms of CPU and GPU stuff, and it's their worst freaking nightmare. The only thing keeping Intel afloat in terms of competition with AMD right now is the vast web of existing vendor relationships that are predicated upon Intel hardware, and it seems like too much work to upend that and try a different vendor. Between that and, you know, availability issues, because again, for all that Intel has struggled with its foundries, it does at least have its own foundries where, you know, AMD has to struggle for time on TSMC foundries along with the entire rest of the world. And that has also limited AMD's ability to distribute parts, basically to tell the entire world, hey, look, we can build as many of these things as you want. So, you know, if you were thinking about building a new line of laptop and ordering, you know, like 20,000 of these tomorrow, please, we'd love that. Knock yourself right out. We can definitely meet that. Like those kind of concerns are the only thing that's kept AMD from putting Intel where Intel put AMD.
OpenAI and NVIDIA's $100 billion AI plan will require power equal to 10 nuclear reactors. Definitely not a bubble.
10 very large nuclear reactors. As some listeners may be aware, I used to be a nuclear reactor operator briefly when I was in the Navy. I worked on an 88 megawatt plant. We're talking about gigawatt plants here. This is a massive amount of energy. We're essentially talking about adding a new major metropolitan area to the country in terms of power consumption.
Arguably more than that. 10 gigawatts is an awful lot.
Yeah, like a typical full-size nuclear power reactor, like the ones that, like 3 Mile Island or like any of the reactors in Canada, are in like the 800 megawatt range, and only the very newest ones are at the like 1,000 megawatt range. And they're talking about 10 of the kind of new ones.
Los Angeles, California generates around 21.2 gigawatt hours of electricity per year.
As another example, the province of Ontario, where I live, has a population of about 16 million people and uses on average 17 to 20 gigawatts of power continuous. The power draw rate this minute is 18 gigawatts. So like half of the power of the entire province of Ontario just dedicated to these data centers. And these are just in addition to what they're already doing. This isn't 10 gigawatts total for AI. This is 10 more gigawatts just for AI.
It's basically ludicrous and not going to happen, right? Like, this is all just pie in the sky bullshit to get more investment. And it's never really going to happen, surely.
Well, I wouldn't say never. I'm sure at some point data centers will account for 10 gigawatts of power.
Maybe. I'm not entirely sure that is the case, because we're starting to talk about not just a lot of power for like the silly computer stuff, but like a lot of power on the scale of the entire activity of the human species. So I don't know that 10 gigawatt data centers are ever realistically going to be like a standard normal thing.
Well, no, again, this is 10 gigawatts of data centers, not one data center using 10 gigawatts. I don't think there's enough cooling that you could actually have that all in one campus without it just being on fire.
Sure. My point is just still, we are getting to the point where our technology is approaching like the limits of physics and our environment. Like, you can't just generate an infinite amount of energy inside a biosphere and have the biosphere survive.
Well, yeah, and speaking of which, a lot of this is probably going to end up coming from gas if it happens. And there's only so much gas to go around. And obviously there's climate impact from that. Of course, the current president thinks that is a con job, so that's fine.
Of course. The buzzword that we haven't brought up yet that I can't let this segment go by without introducing to everyone is circular investing. The only way this kind of investment happens or makes sense, especially in something with no more proven profitability in the real world than AI actually has, is circular investing. This is the worst kind of bubble. Nvidia is investing in OpenAI because OpenAI is ready to buy pretty much everything Nvidia can possibly build. And so they're feeding one another. Nvidia wants to make sure that the gravy train doesn't stop rolling, so it selflessly, quote unquote, gives some of its profits back into the company that's buying all of its crap to begin with. But that company isn't actually producing something profitable. So at some point, it has to end. And if OpenAI hasn't found a way to make itself an actual sustainable, profitable company by then, well, that's when we all get to see yet another bubble pop that's large enough to wreck the entire freaking economy.
I mean, when this bubble pops, and it is when, not if, it's going to make the .com bubble look tiny, potentially.
I think that's probably accurate. When the .com bubble burst, there was a lot more resistance, in my experience, in my opinion, to the idea that like, oh, well, the internet is everything and computers are everything and our whole future depends on this and everybody has to get into it. Like, I think an awful lot more of the common everyday population was not buying into that. Like, at that point, they were still kind of on the fence about whether the internet was great or not at all. There were lots and lots of people who didn't use it at all. And it was not mainstream to have the kind of worship of the internet that a lot of mainstream folks have about AI right now. I mean, so many people have bought into this idea that, we already have hyper intelligent AI that is, smarter than any human and can, do our jobs for us and all this nonsense. It reaches a lot farther.
Well, we saw just recently, OpenAI admits AI hallucinations are mathematically inevitable not just engineering flaws. I mean, how is this news? But okay, at least they've acknowledged it. That's the news bit.
Well, the news is that it means it's not something they're going to be able to fix.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been obvious from the start, hasn't it?
I don't know that everybody realized that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that everybody didn't realize from the start that are getting more and more obvious. The interesting thing, I think, about that article that went over, OpenAI's engineers talking about the literal mathematical inevitability of hallucinations in large language models is I don't think the phenomenon is limited to LLMs. I think this is an inevitable consequence of a free agent learning information in its own way in a relatively unstructured fashion versus like classical formal logic programming. When you use formal logic, we're talking, Bayes stuff here, if, then, and, or. When you define a problem in those senses, you have defined it very, very precisely and tightly. And you can validate the whole thing. You can say this is either entirely valid or it's not entirely valid. Versus when you throw a model at something, well, a model is essentially, you can think of it as just like animate math that just kind of bubbles its way around something. Almost like shrink wrapping it. It slowly gets closer and closer around the edges until it understands the problem well enough. But the issues with hallucinations they're no different than like when you could swear a thing was true. Like everybody has had the experience of, no, I swear I remember like the Berenstain Bears. That's a very classic example. The idea that like we have multiple timelines and we must have, because I'm sure when I was a kid, it was the Berenstain Bears, but now it's Berenstain Bears. So the timeline must have jumped. Well, what do you think that is? That's a freaking hallucination, man. And I don't think you can have a neural network, including organic, that doesn't produce them.
I think the other thing that was interesting in the article was they talked about how the newer versions of the models are getting worse at hallucinating. So the O1 reasoning model, they found hallucinated about 16% of the time, which is kind of alarmingly high. But then they looked at O3 and it hallucinated 33% of the time. So 1 out of 3 answers was just totally made up. But the O4 mini hallucinates 48% of the time. So you kind of have to flip a coin to see if you actually got an answer based on some information or just some computer's fever dream.
It would actually be more useful if it hallucinated more frequently, because then you could consult it and have a good idea that whatever it told you, you shouldn't do that. Whatever that was, nope, that was a bad idea.
So these percentages are for very simple questions like how many Ds are in DeepSeek, and it just gives you just the wrong number, like roughly half the time. But with more complex answers, like, you ask it, please explain this complex topic to me. Does that mean that roughly about half of what it tells you is bullshit then? And like making up references and stuff like that?
Well, if you're giving it more complicated queries that require more complex answers that you might even think of as multiple answers, then basically every answer it's giving you, even if it's coming in one response to one prompt, each separate part of that, there is that percentage chance that it's going to be hallucinated. It's kind of what that comes down to, which means that if you're asking a lot of relatively complex questions that require like paragraphs worth of answer, I mean, we're getting into statistics and probabilities here, but it basically boils down to at least some of all of them is going to be crap. And a lot of them are going to be just wildly and completely crap. Because like, if you had to get the first thing right in order for the next 5 answers to also be correct, and you hallucinated on the first one, you didn't just hallucinate one of those 5 points. You gave incorrect answers on all 5. Versus if it was a 5-step thing and it didn't hallucinate until the 5th step, then it only got 20% of it wrong. Either way, you only had one hallucination, but it can have a much bigger impact. And it means that if you're wanting entirely correct answers, you'd better be asking very simple, very validatable things, and you'd better actually be checking some of the answers yourself.
And at that point, what value does it have?
Exactly. It goes right back to something that I've been saying about AI for a long time now, especially this natural language AI in terms of like asking it questions or wanting it to perform tasks for you. It's toddler help. Can you get it to do stuff for you? Yes. Can you be more productive with that assistance than you could without it? I question that. for most tasks. I mean, I think I'm the only one of the three of us who actually had kids of my own, but having had three of my own toddlers, again, I mean, you can maybe be more productive with toddler help than without it with the toddler, but you're never going to be more productive with toddler help than you would have been with no toddlers in the room. One last thing I want to cover before we close this off is what the meaning of the term hallucination really is, because I think a lot of people have a very incorrect idea guided by just like entertainment media, where it might be fun to show, oh, well, this guy dropped acid, and so now he's seeing all these things that just completely aren't there and out in la la land and are very colorful and fun. And that's not really how hallucination actually works. Hallucination is more along the line, and this is true, again, of models or humans. Hallucinations are more along the lines of a simple error in filtering. So a hallucination is like you see a shadow out of the corner of your eye and you think a dog ran by, but you look up and there's no dog there. Now, if you're really on top of your game, you're going to immediately recognize that as just, oh, I thought there was a dog, but there wasn't. And you're probably not going to call that a hallucination. You'll say, oh, well, I never really fully believed it. I thought that might have been a dog, and then I looked and it wasn't.
I get this regularly, right? I walk around quite a lot at night and I see something in the distance and I could swear that is someone standing there or whatever. And like, it's someone standing there. The closer I get, it's still someone standing there. And then it just changes at some point. And so my brain processed what it was seeing and said, that is someone standing there. But then at some point it got close enough to reinterpret the data and go, no, actually it's not. It's just a sign and a bush or something, whatever.
That is exactly correct. But the point there is there was a thing there that looked human-like, and a very low-level part of your brain, a pattern-matching algorithm, recognized that thing that was human-like and told you with some confidence there was a person there. That is a hallucination. It's not something just created out of thin air, out of whole cloth, that's, big, fancy, flashing lights, whatever. No, it's something that you would expect to see. And it's something that there was something sort of like that there. The real issue is that you didn't check your assumption. That's the difference between a hallucination and just, oh, I thought something was there, but it was different. We don't call that hallucinations usually, but that's the big difference, is in whether or not we made the hardcore assumption that the thing we thought was there really was. And this can also happen with memory. Oh, I swear I remember this thing happened this way, and it really didn't. But again, the issue is that you're not questioning a thing that's in your data set. So when we talk about models, we talk about the trained model itself versus the data set that it was trained on. Now, the model itself has an idea about the structure of things, and it can have a very, very tiny amount of the individual data from the data set it was trained on, but for the most part, it doesn't really have the data. It just has the shape of it. And our brains work the same way, and we can make assumptions that because I have this pattern in my model, that must mean there was this data in the data set, and we're sure of it, and we're wrong. And that's also a hallucination. That's what hallucinations are. Humans do it, LLMs do it. You can't really get away from it with a neural network.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Alexander has done. I have a small pool with 4 drives in 2 mirrors, with 1 more drive as a hot spare. I replicate offsite to rsync.net's ZFS service. So far, so good, but I'm worried about eventual hardware failure. When the system gets uncomfortably old, do I just build a new server, replicate my stuff to it, and demote this one to be a hot spare for the new hardware? How do I decide when getting old is too old, time to upgrade? It sounds like the admins don't trust smart metrics much. Do you have a rule of thumb for how long to keep drives and systems running before demoting them?
I think the 20,000-foot overview is just to look at a system as a unit. That's what most companies I do business with do. They're not really looking at, pieces and parts within a system. They're deciding when to replace or not to replace an entire server or an entire workstation. And there are a lot of different philosophies there. My own personal rule of thumb on that is I expect a server to definitely, absolutely, for a fact, last for 5 years. I pretty much expect it's going to go 7. Usually what I'm doing is I am looking at the server at 5 years, expecting it to be fine, but deciding whether or not I want to pull the trigger early. looking at it at 7 years, basically expecting to be pitching the client, on, hey, it's about time to update this hardware, or looking at it at 7 years, deciding, you know what? I mean, this thing is ticking over completely perfectly fine. I have absolutely no operational concerns. And I'm going to advise the client to just be ready to have the budget to replace that, but we don't need to do anything yet. And we'll revisit again at 9 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently did an inventory of some hardware as we were moving data centers and deciding what was too old to bother moving, and realizing some of our servers are 15 years old now.
Yeah.
The CPU and the RAM and everything still, we've replaced every hard drive. But short of that, the CPUs and the RAM in an air-conditioned data center with very clean power just keep working. Eventually, they're probably not worth the amount of electricity for the number of CPU cycles per second and so on, but the hardware itself can go for a long time. But similar to what Jim was just saying, probably at least 5 years on the hardware, most likely longer. But hard drives, I'm a bit more maniacal about. After about 5 years, they're definitely going down to they don't hold production data anymore. Even the backup, right? Like, I don't want my backup server blowing 4 hard drives in a week. So even for the replicas and the backups and the spares, I'm not necessarily going to keep a bunch of hard drives that are past the 5 years the manufacturer says they're good for. But at the same time, I have some enterprise drives that have lasted since they were built in 2016 and it's 2025 and they're still running. But I just don't trust them to the same degree anymore. As long as you have enough parity and, it's not the only copy of the data, then it's probably fine. And as you said, keeping the old server running as a hot spare in case the primary blows up is perfectly fine. But I'd say on the hardware side, 7+ years is fine. But on hard drives, after 5, it's not allowed to be a primary anymore for me.
It's kind of criminal to just say drives talking about storage, because the failure modes and methods and what to look out for are so different between Rust and solid state. And I think for the most part, what Alan was describing, now a lot of it applies to solid state as well, but I think it mostly he's talking about Rust there. With solid state drives, it's not so much about the years of age on the drive. It's about the amount of data that's been written. And my recommendation there would be you do want to keep an eye on that. And you don't want to expect an SSD to go for the rated write endurance of the drive in production, because while it will probably make it all the way to its rated write endurance, it will be such a horribly performing dog by that last byte that hits that rated write endurance that you might as well be using one of Alan's Rust hard drives instead for all the performance it's going to give you. And that's the best case. Basically, the more you've written to an SSD, the worse it's going to perform, and the more likely it is to have some kind of error that's going to wreck your day. And that can be a media issue. It could be a controller failure. Usually with an SSD, it either just gets unbearably slow or it drops so completely off the bus, your system tells you don't even have a hard drive plugged in anymore. There's not usually much different going on with SSDs than those two failure modes, but usually what you're looking for with those is the amount of data written. And my personal recommendation, you at least want to be in the market to replace an SSD in production by the time it hits 50% of its stated write endurance, because at that point, it will have already begun significantly slowing down. It won't be unbearable yet, but it will be very obvious if you're actually looking at the metrics that the drive is much slower than it was when new.
Yeah, and especially for something that's, more of a personal server type situation, you might want to look at, as the power on hours of those drives are creeping up, replacing, a pair at a time over a bit of time to kind of cushion the blow to your wallet of, having to replace 6 or 8 or more hard drives all in one go. Also, if you've done it that way when you upgraded them this time, 5 years from now, when it's time to do it again, they'll tick over in pairs of 2 at a time instead of all at once, where again, it's going to be another blow to your wallet.
Alternately, if you have a little bit more in the way of, the kind of resources that fold nicely and fit in your back pocket, and a little less in the way of resources that require you to sit around and remember things and, deal with all the little nitpicky stuff, like this is why I push this concept of basically a server being a 3-part unit. You've got production, hot spare, and disaster recovery, / backup. This is why. So you don't have to deal with all this nitpicky whatever. If you've got that level of redundancy at the system level, you can relax a little bit about the individual drives, and you can say, okay, as a general rule, yeah, once this system hits that 5 or 7 or 9 year mark, all those things we said about it, including the drives. But up until that point, because you know you've got a very solid setup in terms of redundancy to minimize the potential both for data loss and for uptime loss, then you can relax with the weird little rules like I update my drives in pairs and I worry about like which pair I'm updating when so I can't have both sides of a mirror fail, like all this stuff. Can you do all that?
I didn't mean it like that. I just meant by spreading out the purchase of the hard drives, you mean it's not taking the same financial hit as trying to replace all the drives at once just because they're old.
Sure. I've done things with computers both ways. I've tried not to spend much money at once, and I've tried not to spend more money than I need to, and the two are very different. In my experience, if you're trying to only buy what you need right then, if you're going to have the same computer at the end of 5 years that you've been updating piece by piece from an old one all along versus you just used your computer for 5 years and then bought a new one, you're going to have spent less money and have a faster computer at the end of it if you just waited and bought a new computer.
On the 1 point of smart metrics, the main one to look at is reallocated sectors for spinning rest drives. If that number is going up, that hard drive is going out.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.